We're incredibly excited to be joined by Dr. Stephen Woodley from Alberta, Canada, and Karl Burkart. First, I'd like to introduce Stephen Woodley. Dr. Woodley is Vice Chair for Science and Biodiversity at the World Commission on Protected Areas, which is part of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Dr. Woodley is an ecologist who has worked in the field of environmental conservation as a consultant, a field biologist, university researcher, and the first Chief Scientist for Parks Canada. Welcome, Dr. Woodley.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to kick things off today and talk about where did large conservation targets come from, and probably more importantly, what should be included in large conservation targets. It's probably worth starting the conversation with some perspective on how big a challenge we're facing. The World Economic Forum says biodiversity loss and climate change are the greatest risks to our global condition. Nature conservation underpins at least half of the sustainable development targets set by the United Nations. And the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services says that the two issues of climate change and biodiversity conservation are interlinked, and we must focus on them together. So that's the scope of the problem. Where did large conservation targets come from? This table is a short history. Back in as early as 1968, we started to come up with international targets for things like biosphere reserves. And right up through into the 90s, we set targets, but they were fairly tepid targets, and they weren't necessarily science-based. We said that we wanted to protect 10% of terrestrial ecoregions. At the World Parks Congress in '82, the famous Brundtland Commission said that we should triple the number of protected areas, which were at that time 4%, and that led to this 12% figure. It was a good political figure, a good political goal, but it wasn't based in science. Along came the Convention on Biological Diversity. These numbers started to ramp up. In 2010, the globe agreed that we would protect at least 17% of terrestrial and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas by 2020. We've met that numerical target, but we haven't really met the qualitative elements of that target, which are highlighted there in yellow, and I'll get into in more detail. We're currently negotiating a new draft global biodiversity framework. And right now in that draft, we want to ensure that 30% of land, seas, and probably fresh water in the new formulation will be protected, with an increasing focus on the qualitative elements of such a target. And for the first time, I think we're into the territory of science-based targets. So how much nature do we need to save? It's a complex question, and it really depends on for what? To protect ourselves, to protect our economy, to protect all species on the planet, or to be ethical, sharing this planet with other organisms. I did a review paper that looked at all the literature on large conservation targets, and the conclusions can be summarized as just basically three ways of doing it. Some people use species area curves. Ed Wilson, for example, used species area curves, where you simply look at how much area, if you protect, will give you what percentage of species protected. Most people use systematic conservation planning, where you put values, ecological values, into a model and come up with a number. And the third way of doing it is to look at the minimum size of ecosystems to avoid regime shifts. The classic example of that is the Amazon, where we probably know now that if we don't protect at least 80% of the Amazon intact, we will have a regime shift there. It will go from a forest to a savanna. The next table just shows some of these papers, and I won't go through this whole table, but just to point out a couple of things. Stu Burkart et al. Said, well, how much area do we need to achieve ACHI target 11? And he ran some models and said, well, the very, very minimum that we would need to meet ACHI target 11 would be 28% of the global terrestrial area. And he said, but that's such a minimum because I wasn't able to include a whole lot of things. Other review papers said, well, it's somewhere between 30 and 41%. In the oceans, Beth O'Leary said, well, if you look at all the studies done, and the average is actually 37% of the ocean, but that only gives you 80% of your conservation objectives. A number of people looked at regional studies. It doesn't matter whether it's South Africa or the Rocky Mountains in the USA, the numbers come out very high. If you want to protect all your conservation targets, you're somewhere between 50 or 62% of a given region. I threw that paper, that line that's in gray, to show Ed Wilson's Half Earth book, because a lot of people will know this. He said he used species area curves, and he said, well, if you want to protect 85% of species on the planet, then you better protect 50% of it. That's simply the math we know from species area curves. And then finally, there is this minimum ecosystem size, and I've already discussed the Amazon. So those are the numbers and the approaches. And the bottom line, it can be easily shown like this. If you have a percentage of area on your y-axis and ecological values on your x-axis, if you want to add in rare species in ecosystems, you get a certain percentage. Everyone will agree to that. If you want to bring in geographically restricted species in ecosystems, the number goes up. If you want to bring in species aggregations like spawning areas or migratory aggregations of sandhill cranes, something like that, you get increasing numbers. Lots of people said, well, we should have representation in our conservation systems and make sure the populations are viable. We have enough area for viability. Connectivity is increasingly recognized and we know fundamentally important. Lots of people want to protect our wilderness areas, and certainly the United States has led on this. If we bring in climate change refugia, the numbers go up further. And then increasingly, we're talking about carbon-rich ecosystems and protecting that. So depending on the values you put in a systematic conservation planning approach, you get higher and higher numbers. And the bottom line is that the minimum value set is 30%. So that's an absolute floor that we should be thinking about. The full value set comes out very much higher, sometimes 70 or 80%. And the average of those comes out around 50%. So those people, like my friend Harvey Locke, who have been going around the planet saying nature needs half, they're actually not crazy after all. It is firmly based in science, and maybe even half isn't enough. So this was the conclusions of that paper. And the important thing I wanted to point out in this conclusion is that it's not just the number. It's not just 30 or 50. It's really where we put that number and how we manage those areas, which is going to be the key to success. Just to make sure that the scientists, there was agreement in the scientific community, we went out and ran a survey, a global survey of conservation scientists and asked them what they think. We were able to get responses from 335 scientists in 81 countries, as shown in the map there. We did this in 3 languages. And lo and behold, we had fabulous agreement that yes, the large area-based targets were critical for global conservation. They all agreed that the current ACHI targets of 17% and 10 were not sufficient. They weren't based in science, and that the quality elements were very important here. So we asked them what else should go into the qualitative elements. And interestingly enough, some of the things that people are going to be talking about, like connectivity areas, conservation networks, protection of geographically restricted species, etc., these all came out as important. So the bottom line here is that the scientific community is really of one mind on this. There's huge agreement that we need to really ramp up our conservation efforts. And it's great to see the movement to 30 by 30 as an interim step to moving towards living sustainably on the planet. And really a lot of support for doing this using systematic conservation planning. I want to turn now to what counts, because if we're going to protect 30 or more percent of the planet, what should count in that 30% is a fundamental part of the discussion. The Commission on Protected Areas just led on this document. It's available online in French and Spanish as well as English. And it focuses on clarifying what counts based upon global agreement. We already have global agreement on what counts through the Convention on Biological Diversity and through the IUCN. I know the United States is not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Nonetheless, the US is an active participant in the convention, and it is a member of the IUCN and voted recently by resolution to support exactly these kinds of things at the meeting which was held just a couple of weeks ago in Marseille. So what counts is that the 30% figure should include only protected areas and OECMs. And OECM stands for Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures. And that wording isn't mine. It comes out of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there's been a lot of work into defining what that is. And I'll go over it briefly because it may not be common language in the US context. There is also agreement that we should use existing CBD and IUCN guidance on the definition and implementation of these things. We want to make sure that protected areas have clear conservation objectives with a nature first conservation mandate. Importantly, in OECMs and in protected areas, there's 4 governance types. This does not have to be done by government only. From an IUCN perspective, we want to make sure that the governance types of Indigenous and local communities is fundamentally front and center here. I'm speaking to you today from Algonquin territory in Canada, and there is a great evolving partnership in Canada and in many places in the world to have Indigenous protected areas as a leadership in this whole initiative. And I'm really pleased to see the people who will be coming later to speak on this, and they'll do a far better job than I in speaking on this topic. OECMs are not meant to be multiple use production areas like production forests or plantations or fisheries areas. They're important to do right and to do sustainably, and they're counted in other ways under other targets under the biodiversity treaty. All of these things should be reported. We have, and this applies to all countries in the world, to report their protected areas and OECMs through to UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this definition of OECMs. They're basically the same as protected areas, except that they don't have a dominant conservation outcome. They weren't set up for conservation. The difference is that the way they're managed leads to positive and sustained long-term outcomes for in situ or nature-based whole ecosystem conservation. That's the definition under the CBD, and the IUCN, including the US, just voted for this for this guidance and this definition. Here's some examples of what should and shouldn't count under OECMs. Certainly indigenous and community conserved areas will be the dominant theme here and have been all along. Some coastal and marine areas protected for other reasons. There's examples of big areas protected for historic shipwrecks, for example, or even where there's been munition dumping, where there's been no fishing, and you have great biodiversity outcomes, they can be counted. Some production landscapes have no-go areas inside them, like FSC representative forests. Many cities have watershed protection areas where they have great biodiversity conservation within the watershed protection zone. Many community pastures and indeed private ranches with native prairie that are managed well can be set up as OECMs. And as we've done in Canada already, some sections of military reserves can count to the word conservation areas. What shouldn't count are urban parks and formal gardens, temporary fishing closures that are in place only until overfished areas recover, heavily grazed grasslands or grasslands replanted with non-native species, large areas that are managed for a single species. For instance, the whale sanctuary off Hawaii, which is huge, and it's meant to protect harassment of humpback whales. That is a single species measure. It's not in situ conservation. So all of these, when we set up these protected areas in OECMs, we should focus on the most important areas for biodiversity. There's some great tools to do that, including the new IUCN Key Biodiversity Areas Standard. NatureServe is leading on an initiative in the United States to define key biodiversity areas. In fact, many of them have been identified already as important bird areas. In addition to KBAs, there are EBSs, ecologically and biologically significant marine areas, important mammal areas, and there's equivalent ranking systems for high priority areas in the country. That is critical. We don't want to just throw everything in the basket. We want to focus on areas that are important for biodiversity. And then finally, it's got to be done equitably. I'm speaking from a science perspective. We know that we will not achieve this goal, even of 30%, without the leadership, support, and partnership of indigenous peoples. This applies globally. We know conservation works best when it's equitable. It's based on full participation, shared and transparent decision-making, and it's based on free, prior, and informed consent. And many other people are going to expand this topic better than I can. IUCN has a whole bunch of guidance on this, and I put this slide up just to point this out, but we already have global agreement on speaking a common language for conservation. It doesn't have to be reinvented. I'm going to conclude with, does 30 by 30 apply equally in all places? And of course it doesn't. Here's a paper that led by my pal Harvey Locke in National Science Review, and it looks at the world simply as three global conditions: as cities and farms, as shared lands, and large wild areas. This is the state of play of the world right now. And of course, we're going to do different things in these different regions. We can't do everything in the same place. You can't protect 30% in some countries in the world or in some parts of the United States. So we have to think about applying three global conditions and putting our conservation actions differently in different places. In cities and farms, we're going to be working with endangered species, protecting ecosystem fragments, doing ecosystem restoration, etc. In the shared landscapes, we're going to be taking a classical conservation biology approach to conservation through nodes and corridors and network conservation systems. And in large wild areas, we're going to be focusing on a conservation first approach where we have to protect the entire the entire system, and any development in those is focused on keeping that entire system intact. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much, and I hope this was a good kickoff to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woodley. Incredibly informative, and I love the picture that you ended with. That's got to be one of the most colorful species I've seen in a while. So a nice bright view to start our morning off. So our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Karl Burkart. Karl's the Deputy Director of One Earth and formerly the Director of Media Science and Technology at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. So let's be honest. I know what the questions are going to be after he's done. What's Leo like? But let's please try to focus on the science for just a little while. So getting back to that, his work at One Earth supports academic institutions and NGOs working on the cutting edge of climate and energy science, biodiversity mapping, and sustainable food systems. Welcome, Karl.
Thank you. It's so exciting. I'm really happy to be here. And I think Dr. Woodley gave us a sense of how big the mountain is. And hopefully I'll be giving you some snacks now. So we feel like it's not so daunting. So as mentioned, I'm Karl Burkart. We are a philanthropic initiative, and we're dedicated to scaling philanthropy and cutting edge science. And I'm gonna be talking today now about the role of geospatial science in seeing nature as it really is, and how this new superpower that technology is giving us can help shape our long-term conservation goals and planning efforts. And I forgot to mention, sorry about my blurry camera. It's a little bit of an error on our side, but hopefully you'll have some fun things to look at here. So we decided to call this talk Seeing Things Whole, which is a phrase coined by John Wesley Powell. Military buffs will know this man as the famed one-armed Civil War hero, but he was also an important geologist and environmentalist, maybe even the first environmentalist. He was a second director of the USGS, and he rafted and mapped the Colorado River. He was also the inventor of the concept of bioregions, which is the foundational idea when we think about large-scale and transnational conservation planning. Nature basically isn't particularly interested in political boundaries. So Powell proposed a framework of governance over water rights, specifically organized by geologically defined regions. And while watersheds, what we're looking at here, are a powerful organizing framework from the perspective of water resources management, when it comes to terrestrial conservation, that's the preservation of biodiversity on land, we need a different biogeographical framework dictated by dominant assemblages of plants, or ecoregions. So Bioregions 2020 is what we use. It was developed with the help of a network of scientists who in 2017 published a major update on biotic assemblages called Ecoregions 2017. In this framework, there are 844 terrestrial ecoregions that have been delineated, and those we've clustered those into 185 bioregions. And this framework is particularly useful when exploring large-scale and transnational land use planning. Let's see. That works. It's also a really fun way to learn more about the ecosystems around you. So we built this interface here, which you can all go online and see, that people can find their bioregions, click, and explore more about all the ecoregions and the plants and animal species that inhabit the world around them. So with that as some background, we at One Earth asked a simple question: how much nature is left in each of these different bioregions? And we were really surprised that while there was some really great literature, as Dr. Woodley reviewed, we didn't find a global scale analysis at a sufficient resolution to estimate and classify different types of natural lands, which could be used for conservation. So we partnered with Resolve and a team of data scientists and conservation experts to answer that question. It was published last year in Science Advances, and it's the peer-reviewed paper is called A Global Safety Net. Oops, I think went backward. called a global safety net to reverse biodiversity loss and stabilize the Earth's climate. It kind of works the other way, the sort of the bottom up. It's a geospatial analysis that brings together about 14 different prioritizations by other peer-reviewed literature. So it's a companion paper to a global deal for nature, which many of you may have heard about. These papers have over 300 citations and are a primary reference for the UN post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the replacement for the Aichi targets, one of them. This paper highlights the famous 30 by 20 formula that is often cited in literature on the 30 by 30 target and is referenced in national and subnational government target setting efforts. For example, New Mexico, you may have seen, just recently adopted a 30 plus 20 target. So I thought we'd play a short video which explains all the different component layers, and you could kind of get to see it at the same time. So we'll do that now.
Nature is key to rebalancing our global climate system and ensuring a vibrant future for all. Ecosystems absorb carbon from the atmosphere and produce the essentials for life on our planet: fresh water, clean air, and healthy soil. Intact natural lands also help to prevent viral outbreaks like COVID-19. Tragically, in the past 50 years, we've lost half of our natural land, destroying 2/3 of all living creatures on Earth. We must reverse the damage, and we can, by creating the global safety net, a network of land areas that are vital for nature and humanity. The global safety net is the first comprehensive estimate of the total land area requiring protection to solve the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. There are 6 main layers that make up the global safety net. First are areas already protected by governments, totaling 15% of the planet's land. Second are species rarity sites. These are additional areas that need to be protected immediately before rare animals and plants are lost forever. Third are high biodiversity areas, groupings of plants and animals that are vital to maintaining our ecosystems. Fourth are large mammal landscapes, like the Pantanal wetlands of western Brazil, home to the world's largest jaguars. Fifth are areas with a large extent of intact wilderness, continuous forests, shrublands, and grasslands. Sixth are land areas that provide additional carbon absorption and storage, helping to stabilize our global climate system. The global safety net also incorporates an analysis of potential wildlife corridors, areas of degraded land that can be restored to connect ecosystems back together, allowing nature to be more resilient as the Earth warms. Taken together, the layers of the global safety net total approximately 50% of the world's land, offering a blueprint to restore our biosphere, helping to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and providing the ecosystem services vital to our survival. Over 1/3 of these lands are communally held by Indigenous peoples, which demonstrates the importance of safeguarding territorial rights for these communities. You can explore the global safety net through a new web application, which displays how every country and region can contribute in different ways towards this common goal. Visit gsnapp.org to learn more about your region and how it can contribute towards a world in which nature and humanity coexist and thrive together.
So to recap, the GSN Global Safety Net study finds that it's actually 50.4% of the terrestrial surface is vital for biodiversity and carbon storage. And collectively, these areas store approximately 2 trillion tons of carbon above and below ground, absorbing about 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. And if you see the box on the top left, the report finds that about 28% of the land in North America is noted of particular importance for biodiversity, plus another 35% for intact lands and carbon storage, which is gives us a total 63%. So these areas currently store approximately 568 gigatons of carbon, which, as you'll note, is more than 1/4 of the global total. So it's a very, very important area. And that's why one of the reasons why this Salazar Symposium is so exciting, to have Mexico, Canada, and the US talking about this area collectively. So we wanted to make the data widely accessible to decision makers, and with Google Earth, we developed an online app. Here we've selected US states. You can select different boundaries. You can click on a state here, and it pulls up a little table. It tells you the different types of layers that were found through this analysis. You can also explore the data by country or by bioregion, and get the same kind of data when you click on each bioregion. We also include the first ever global scale connectivity scenario, which is really meant to establish statistics. It's not meant to be a literal connectivity scenario, but does give us a sense of the potential to create the net in the global safety net to really link together these important biodiversity areas. So key finding from this analysis, and this hasn't been published yet, but we'll share it with you today, is that, of course, as Dr. Woodley said, 30 by 30 is not a one-size-fits-all target. Every country and every state has a different, quote-unquote, inventory of natural lands, and they can contribute differently in their own unique ways. We find that approximately 1/3 of the world's countries actually have insufficient land for a 30 by 30 target, and that's the yellow countries on the map. The light green countries are sort of in the sweet spot where a 30 by 30 goal makes sense, in many cases an interim goal. And other countries, those dark green countries, are identified as especially important for biodiversity and actually, we believe, require higher targets. And one key insight from all of this is that perhaps administrative boundaries aren't the best confine within which to develop science-based conservation plans and targets. More sophisticated geospatial products and tools are needed to examine each bioregion and develop optimizations and priorities. So I'm going to run through very quickly in the time remaining just some examples of things that One Earth is working on and supporting along with other foundations. This is, and these are things that are about to come out or coming out in the next year to two. Here is a visual analytics framework for conservation planning, which was led by Ross Maciejewski, who's actually a leader in decision theater in wartime and high-risk contexts. And so there's a great amount of math and learning from how to do decision-making in risk environments, and that was applied here to conservation and to create a new sort of framework for conservation, selection of lands, and connectivity. And we have a new paper coming out, which we're funding for the US, and we're hoping to get Canada done, which is mapping primary and old growth forests. This is just showing forest canopy by height. And it looks like quite a lot in the US, but if you peel back the lower level trees, you can see that there's a lot less, and these are these bluer areas. So this paper will be coming out at 300 meters resolution, and we think it's going to be really sort of like the center stage. Primary forests really, especially in North America, need to take center stage in large scale planning. It should be the first priority. For planning at bioregion scale, we're happy to be supporting Terra Adapt, which is a remarkable tool for multi-stakeholder engagement on conservation. And this platform includes dynamic models, including annual cycles of land cover, shown right, and regional climate models, importantly, that can help anticipate the impacts of climate change and actually incorporate those in decision-making. So this could include predicting the emergence of refugia as the planet warms, and the places species can go. And, really, I guess the point is we can't create conservation plans anymore in a box. We have to predict the future to maximize both biodiversity and carbon outcomes. There are also some very important developments in novel technology to better understand ecosystems. This thing here that looks like a psychedelic painting is actually an image of a forest from space. It's called spectral LiDAR. It's a technology pioneered by Greg Asner at ASU, and it allows the detection of distinct tree species remotely. And with the launch of a new satellite mission in 2023, we will, for the first time, be able to see beta diversity or complexity in a forest from space. And this will be a game changer for environmental conservation and prioritization. And there's an exciting new project now led by Center for Large Landscape Conservation and the World Conservation Monitoring Center to create a global database of corridors. And that's so states and NGOs can collaborate on transnational connectivity scenarios. And pictured here are two remarkable plans, the Florida Wildlife Corridor on the left and the Southeast Asian Tiger Corridor proposal on the right. And these efforts to link together refugia will help biodiversity to thrive as the planet warms, and be an important way that states can collaborate together. And lastly, one last thing I want to call out is the massive opportunity in the US that a lot of people don't think about, which we call Heartland Restoration. As many of you know, grasslands can store extraordinary amounts of carbon underground and are not as susceptible to fire. An important paper by Bruno Basso at University of Maryland finds that nearly 1/4 of cropland in the Midwest US is no longer productive. Yet farmers are still spending a lot of money fertilizing these unproductive lands for very little yield. So restoring these lands back to grasslands would be a double win for farmers who save money on fertilizer while also potentially getting paid to store carbon. So this represents really a massive carbon removal opportunity in the US, as much as 4 gigatons or 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal. So just to end, when we say, seeing things whole, I think what we're really talking about is being able to zoom out and zoom in and seeing the bigger picture and how this bigger picture and the smaller picture connect. And we now have the technologies and tools to see and understand the complexity of ecosystems. We've never really had this vision before. So now we can act to protect, connect, and restore nature, creating a biosphere that's safe for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karl. It's amazing how data can drive and deliver on some of the promise of how not only we track and observe, but also how we engage. And I think there's this really interesting moment right now that both you and Dr. Woodley have described of that intersectionality. So we're going to move into a little bit of Q&A. So hopefully both of you have your thinking caps on. This is when we're only to camp 1 on Everest. We got to decide what to do with all this stuff. So some of the questions that have come in, and I'll open this one to you, Dr. Woodley, first. Given these percentages, what do we do with ecosystems that have already lost greater than 90% of their former terrain, as is true for various grassland ecosystems, such as a tall grass prairie? How do you come back from that? Do you come back from that? How do you engage at that level?
I think that's a great question, and Karl has already touched on it. Really, in some cases we won't come back from these. We have to be realistic about that. We have to feed 7 billion going to 9 billion people. We have to be realistic about that as we do our planning. However, there are still a lot of opportunities for ecological restoration. We're in the UN Decade of Restoration. Karl's already pointed out the restoration opportunities which exist in grassland systems in the world. We prop a lot of these agricultural systems up with subsidies. In Target 3 of the Aichi targets, all countries of the world were supposed to review their subsidies and look at where there were perverse incentives. We spectacularly failed as a planetary group of countries in doing that. But it's a job that still has to be done. We have to remove those perverse subsidies where we're farming unproductive lands only because of the subsidies and turn them back into nature conservation. We're pretty good at restoring ecosystems, and there's a great opportunity out there.
That's great. Karl, any perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, we got to protect what we have left. And, I think there's this triage, this sort of urgent triage needed, which is why research of Dr. Woodley and others is so important. But that being said, One Earth, we're very, very bullish on carbon dioxide removal through nature. And we actually have supported research to kind of understand what the technical potential is through another set of papers, and new paper will be coming out soon. It's a big opportunity. It's at least 120 gigatons through forestry, forest biome pathways, and that's gigatons of carbon through the century. Now, some of that will be taken up with ongoing emissions, but it's when you realize how big of the potential is for a relatively low cost, and it really can keep the window open to 1.5 C. I mean, I think that's something we all need to keep in mind. And like I said, grasslands are becoming more and more interesting to people. I think when you see there are many reasons for the fires in the U.S., not just drought. Of course, drought is the driver, but there's also poor forest management, which is the two coming together has created this tinderbox. But the reality is trees are vulnerable to fire, and we will have more fire as the planet warms, and the planet will definitely warm. So grasslands are a really exciting opportunity. They in some research, they just will continue building taproots for 30, 40, 50 years, storing more and more carbon every year. So I love the idea of like having the farmers in the Midwest actually becoming a key part of the climate solution.
That's interesting, Karl. You bring up a good point that I think is really facing the reality on the ground right now. And this question is for both of you, because I think this is a data pivot that needs to be considered within the matrix. So given that the climate is shifting, how can climate-induced environmental changes be taken into consideration with national conservation agendas? Because I think when you have the link between the data, the science, and then the perception of impact, how do you find the center of those three spokes?
Well, I'll let Dr. Woodley talk about it too, but I will tell you that I call it a superpower in this talk because until very, very, very recently, we did not have the ability to downscale the global climate models, which is through the IPCC. And there was a big release of that a couple months ago, a month and a half ago, to downscale those to regional, so we can actually understand how the global climate changes are going to affect regions differently. That research is coming out now. So we actually now do have the ability to factor in regional climate changes, and that's Terra Adapt, which is the project I mentioned. There, I forgot to mention, that's the Cascades region, which is about half in Canada, half in the US. There's a project there that's been going on for about a year and a half to test out the technology that integrates conservation, optimization, and climate models. As far as I know, I think it's the first. There's probably other people working on it, but and that's led by Resolve and the Cascadia partnership, and we support that along with Google Earth, and we're hoping that now that can scale to other bioregions, and we can start applying that software to help other regions figure out how their landscapes are going to change.
So the climate and biodiversity crisis are interrelated on many different levels. I mean, we talk about them, we talk about protecting nature because we're going to tie up carbon and lessen the biodiversity crisis, but dealing with climate change is going to save ecosystems. If we move outside the 1.5 degree temperature rise globally, all hell is going to break loose, frankly, in our ecosystems, and our ability to predict what's going to happen isn't very good. We're trying now. There's some great new tools being developed, but it's critical that we work on, not on adaptation, but on the mitigation side of the climate crisis, so that we limit and allow these ecosystems to adapt to even a 1.5 temperature increase. And the other thing is, and I know Jody Hilty is going to speak about this later, we need these systems to be connected, because the ability of ecosystems to adapt is a function of how connected they are. And even at 1.5, even at 1, we have ecosystem species on the move. And if they're not connected, their ability to adapt is much less. So that's why we have to see these as integrated solutions from many different perspectives.
That's great. Well, I'd like to take the turn to this sort of macro-micro conversation, because we've been talking about a lot of large landscape engagement and protection at this point. But one of the questions that has also come in and is regarding some of those urban corridors, some of the places that when you think about high carbon sinks or sequestration, high urban development areas, biodiversity hotspots. In your estimation, what other current or future spatial data efforts, either in the United States or other countries, will you think will become more readily available that can be used to inform some more meaningful conversation and action by conservation leaders, not only in remote areas, but also in some of these urban corridors? Do you think that that will become a part of this larger conversation?
I can start on that. I think the answer is clearly yes. I tried to show the three conditions approach, and Karl had basically a different, an ecological regions approach to the same problem. We need different solutions in different places. And in the urban areas where we all live, we don't give up on nature conservation. We have to work hard on nature conservation. I know some great city planners, municipal planners who are doing fabulous conservation work right around the earth. There is a move to make London a 50% green space, for example, connected. I know of connectivity plans in Calgary and Toronto in Canada. So we have to work at all these scales to be successful. It's not simply a matter of protecting only the remaining wilderness we have on the planet. We have to work right across the 100%. So in thinking about 30% protection, 30% will only be effective if we're really good at the rest of the 70% as well, and manage it sustainably.
Amen. I mean, and I would say in terms of the technology, there's two classes. I think one is actually observation itself, like the beta diversity I mentioned is really going to be great at picking out those little cherries left on the ground that we can actually, as Dr. Woodley said, they can become micro refugia actually, which help us connect landscapes together. So that might be in a suburb just outside of a major city. Like I live in Philadelphia. I'm next to the Wissahickon Woods, which is basically in the city, but it's a huge biodiversity refuge. So I think we'll have that observation superpower. And I think the other superpower will be artificial intelligence in decision making, which is why we've invested in some of this new research in how you take all this new data and help decision makers actually make meaning out of it. So I'd say in terms of tech, those two are going to emerge as really powerful aid in our quest here.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm going to say it out loud. I'm going to say the G word, government. So how can governments better support and coordinate landscape scale conservation efforts to achieve some of these conservation efforts? Obviously, today and tomorrow, we're joined by folks from Canada, by folks from Mexico. There's obviously a lot going on in the EU. How do we engage not only in creating things like 30 by 30 that Dr. Woodley mentioned, but to your point, Dr. Woodley, the other 70%, how do we make sure that it's being talked about both at a policy and programmatic level in an effective way?
I think that's what's referred to as mainstreaming, where we mainstream biodiversity and climate into all the decisions we make. The good news is, I'm sure everybody in this meeting can give us great examples of mainstreaming. It's happening right across the board. We're seeing biodiversity considerations happening in all ministries of government. We're seeing it in banks and business and business standards and the international lending institution standards. It's happening right across the board. There are some great ways governments can, I think, seed this. I love the large landscape cooperatives movement that happened in the United States. I think that led to some really fertile ideas and bringing people together and cross-fertilization. But I think the solution is that biodiversity conservation and the climate problem is all of our problems. It's every single person, from someone who drives a truck to builds a hotel. We have to all think about how this impacts biodiversity, because we're all living here on one planet and there's no other option.
Yeah, it's really well put. And I mean, I would say also, decision making is cheap. Implementation is costs money. So the more collaboration that can happen at different jurisdictional scales, the better. That Cascadia project I mentioned is really exciting because state, county, and municipal governments, and then it extended into Canada. And I'm not exactly sure which jurisdictions were involved, but just the idea of these governments collaborating around a common project to protect the sort of biosphere that's important for that region is relatively inexpensive. And you think about, it costs money to save nature, right? Like basically a paper came out, Waldron et al., that estimated, roughly to do 30 by 30 properly, we need about 150 billion a year. We're currently getting about 25 billion a year implemented. So we have a big gap there. And some of that is just, we could take out, imagine if you can plan together, that money, a little bit of money can sort of have a double impact. So I think governments investing together in collaboration is a key pathway too, as I see it.
You've given us a lot of hope for the conversation and a lot of understanding about the connectivity surrounding data and how we engage that data to keep hope alive, frankly. So Karl, Dr. Woodley, can't thank you enough for joining us this morning. Everyone, please join me in a virtual round of applause for both of our participants so far. Thank you for kicking us off in the right way.